pyramid texts are the oldest religious books known ever. First recorded on the internal walls of the chambers and aisles of the pyramid of King Unas in Saqqara. Then they were continued to be recorded inside the pyramids of the kings of the 6th dynasty and their wives in southern Saqqara. The recording of these texts that were recorded for the first time in the pyramid of Unas doesn't mean that they represent the result of the religious thinking only in his time, but they actually represent the result of the religious ideology since the most ancient ages. But they were first recorded in the reign of this king Unas. The pyramid texts are not homogeneous, but they could sometimes represent ideas and visions contradicted to each other, and they are not concerned just with the deceased king, but they may sometimes point to the living king, and they differ in their details from one pyramid to another. For example, some spells that came in the texts of Unas pyramid did not come in the pyramids of the kings of the 6th dynasty and their wives. This shows a development in the Egyptian religious ideology, which means that the Egyptian thinking continued to evolve and rephrase during the time of recording these texts. Thus, the Egyptian left us new ideas that fit his time in the pyramids that belong to the end of the Old Kingdom, differing from those recorded by the beginning of the 5th dynasty. The French scientist Maspero discovered these texts between 1810 and 1880 AD in the pyramids of Wanis and Pepi I and Meri in Ra and Pepi II. The pyramid texts differed between dramatic and magical, or old mythologies and chants and prayers and spells and texts and offering rituals and others. The pyramid texts are considered a guarantee and achievement of happiness to the king in the afterlife, and they aim at the protection of the deceased king from what may face him of evil in the netherworld. For they cast light on the form of the netherworld and how the deceased might reach it. The texts show the effect of the different creeds that appeared on the ancient Egyptian surface, like the creed of Heliopolis, which makes God Ra a center to that netherworld, which that creed considered it located in the sky, in addition to the mythologies of Osiris and the struggle between Horus and Set. The pyramid texts picture the phase of the transition of the deceased king, usually in the shape of a star or the figure of the sun god. They are both connected to the Egyptian creeds since antiquity. Thus he wished to be like the sun that roams the sky and comes back in each new morning. The texts also show how the deceased meets the innate and becomes as holy as them, and how he ascends to the sun boat and swims in the sky where the netherworld exists. When he reaches the sky, he changes its shape into a bird like the falcon or the kite or the goose. He used the forces of nature like the wind and the storms. There is another imagination that it lies under the ground and is dominated by god Osiris, and that the deceased turns into Osiris. It's noticeable that the ancient Egyptian imagined the place of the netherworld at the time the pyramid texts were written was in the sky, and the ideology about the netherworld, called Duat, was not yet completed. The rituals play an important role in the pyramid texts, like opening the mouth ritual, and the offerings presentation, and the purification rituals, and the incense burning, and the perfuming, which makes them look like they're a group of rituals connected with the burial of the dead and his existence in the netherworld. There are researchers who see that they are a group of spells describing the ascending of the deceased to the sky, or helping him to transform into a spirit in the netherworld. The pyramid texts didn't forget to give an image of the real Egyptian life and what happens inside the palace, and the relation between the king and his assistants, although the pyramid texts pictured that to be what expects him in the afterlife. It's noticeable that these texts has offered a strong rhetorical image from the ancient Egyptian against darkness and death, for the texts had never acknowledged death in reality, but it explained it to be an ascending and a transfiguration of the deceased king from the world of humans to the celestial world of the gods in the sky. Like the text which says, King Teti did not die a true death, but he came glorified in the horizon. Or, come on, King Wanis, you have not traveled dead, but you traveled alive. You have traveled so that you can live, and you did not travel to die. You will never die. This King Pepi will not die. The pyramid text expressed the look of the Egyptian to the other life and eternity, although that right was confined to kings and not to the common people. For the Egyptians thought that eternity and immortality lie on the other side of life, which starts after death. The end of the Old Kingdom era and entering an era of the first transition, and the country passing by an unstable period, had included all aspects of life and had a great influence in changing the beliefs of the people and their relation with their gods and the theory of life after death, especially after the divine picture of the kingship had been shaken in the Old Kingdom, and then began a new approach of regarding the Pharaoh as a human. A new ray of light appeared to the common people, which is the possibility of achieving the same fate of the kings, which is the resurrection and enjoying life in the Osirian kingdom, especially after the expansion of the Osirid Creed and its taking a leading position for the people. The deceased, either a king or an individual, became an Osir and was called Ma'khiru, which means the one with an honest voice, or the acquitted. The Osirid style overwhelmed the coffin's texts. Thus the talking about the netherworld became more than that of the celestial world. Instead of picturing Osiris, who is connected with the netherworld, ascending to the sky, God Ra became pictured lowering himself down and descending to the netherworld, the Duat. Accordingly, the common people started to record their texts on their wooden coffins that became known as a funeral literature called the Coffin's texts, and it's an evolution of the pyramid texts in the Old Kingdom, which was just confined for the pharaohs. The deceased in the ancient Egyptian creed would encounter obstacles called gates in the netherworld. Between one gate and another, he may encounter other obstacles, and he must face them and overcome them in order to be allowed to pass. The deceased must know and recite some spells while climbing to the netherworld, so that gates might open for him, and so that his progress isn't stopped, and he might not be burnt by its destructive fire. There are many words that came in the religious texts and non-religious texts in the ancient Egyptian language, and were used to point to the gates and entrances. Some of them were used within the frames of the religious texts in the books of the netherworld. One of the most important words is Sebchet, which means a door or a gate to each of the houses and palaces and temples and the sky and the kingdom of the dead. This word has appeared since the Old Kingdom and continued until the Ptolemaic period, and was basically used in the religious books. The word Sebchet is derived from the verb sebech, which means to surround or besiege or contain, and takes the same ideogram of the word. That word points to a sort of the gates of the netherworld, crossed by the dead and guarded by demons. The gates of the netherworld were described with dreadful names to put fear into the hearts of those who would try to cross them. Each gate had its own special name that reflects the nature of that gate and what's in it of surprises and dangers waiting for whoever dares to come close to it or even pass through it. The gates of the netherworld in the ancient Egyptian creed had names. Amongst them is the name of the first gate in chapter 146, the master of earthquakes, the one with high walls, the master of crushing. The third gate is called the master of slaughter. The sixth is called the master of darkness, the one filled with screams, as well as other names that suggest what's awaiting the passerby of reward or punishment. The gates of the netherworld are diverse, and their number and shapes differed across ages. The names given by texts to these gates differed as well. The Old Kingdom referred to the gates of the netherworld, for the Pyramids texts pointed to the gate of Akhet and the eastern entrance to the sky, and mentioned the existence of 2 gates or 4 big gates of the sky. These gates were described with their having great flames, and that fire surrounded them from all sides. The coffin's texts point to the gates which the deceased need to cross, and they reach 3 gates or Sebchut. The first gate was made of blue flames, and its fire touched whoever passes through it. The height of its fire on both sides reaches 50 arms. Thus, the deceased calls for the help of God Atum against the guard of that black gate. Then he heads towards God Osiris to save him from the guard of the second gate, which steals the souls. As for the third gate, it can be approached, for it's surrounded by fire, and that place is considered the most dangerous one. The ancient Egyptian was keen on writing down the prayers and spells that opened to him the doors of the netherworld, or helped him in going in and out across them without being endangered, in addition to his knowledge of the names of these gates and their guards. The number of the spells that belong to the coffin's texts reach 1,200 spells, recorded throughout the first intermediate period and the Middle Kingdom, on both the outer and inner surfaces of the coffins, and on the canopic boxes, and over the panels and papyri. These texts were found in various sites in Egypt, like El-Lesht, Bani Hassan, Asyut, El-Birsha, El-Qaw al-Kibir, Sedment al-Jabal, Akhmim, Abydos, Thebes, El-Jabalain, Saqqara, Abu Sir, and Dahshur. The purpose of the coffin's texts was to guarantee the eternal life for the deceased. Just like the pyramid's texts differed in some points and went along in others, the same thing happened in the coffin's texts. The deceased take many forms in the coffin texts, for with each text comes a different figure. These texts highlighted the attempts of the deceased to avoid the tough deeds in the netherworld, in the fields and in other places. The Ushabti statues had to do these tasks. Both of Osiris and Ra played a balanced role in the creeds of the coffin's texts. A new direction in the coffin's texts appeared in the books of the netherworld. This direction showed the netherworld as a place surrounded by risks of all kinds and in numerous shapes. The means to overcome these obstacles that face the deceased was to be armed with a number of spells to protect him, and these spells were written either in or out of the coffins. For every danger that faced the deceased in ancient Egypt, a spell was told upon him to push away and defeat that danger. Among the dangers which the Egyptian has imagined was the cutting off of the head of the deceased, or to face the demons and the imaginative beings. These dangers grew in number and varied in type in the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom. Amongst the ideas that were discussed in the coffin's texts was the idea of resurrection and immortality, which became the right of individuals after it was confined to the kings only in the pyramid's texts. Some segments talked about words and secrets that achieve immortality in the afterlife, including the text which says, "For any man who knows these words, he will never decay or perish." Chicago University took the responsibility of gathering the coffin's texts and arranging and publishing them. This grand work was done by the leadership of the scientist D. Buck, who succeeded in the 50s of the 20th century in publishing these texts in a big volume composed of 7 parts. In 2006, Chicago University produced the 8th volume of the group, and it included a collection of texts never published before, and included copies of the pyramid's texts that were found on the coffins of the Middle Kingdom. As for the translations of these texts and the observations about them, several translations of the coffin's texts were done, the most famous of which was Faulkner and Samuel Mercer to English. The best of these translations was a translation done by Parjay in French language.